for joining us. You've taken the time to dial into this webinar. And sorry for the slight delay, we've just been having a few technical problems, which always seems to be the way. Thanks again for everyone for joining. And the webinar today is entitled Understanding Sudden Bereavement, Providing Effective Support to Suddenly Bereaved People. And just to start the webinar, I'm going to provide a quick overview of how we're going to run it and just some quick housekeeping, and then we're going to get going. So during the webinar, all attendees are going to be placed on mute mode. So we're not going to be able to hear from anyone. The only people that you're going to be able to hear from are either myself or our presenter, Dr Linda Machin. And Linda's structured her presentation so it's in a few sections, and it's going to allow for a few natural breaks of questions. And if you've got a question at any point, in the GoToWebinar software that's at the side of your computer, there's a question box, and if you type a question into that, then I'll be able to read it. I'll take a note of all the questions, and when Linda's ready for some questions, I'll ask those to her. So speaking at our webinar today, we're very lucky to have bereavement expert and honorary research associate at Keele University, Dr Linda Machin, whose presentation is entitled Working with Grief. And we're delighted to have such a prestigious speaker at the event. It's a real privilege to be able to hear from Linda, and thanks very much to her again for giving up her time today for this webinar. And it's fantastic to have a real field leader talking today. And as a quick bit of background, Linda's a bit of an expert in the field of bereavement support, and she's published several leading models, which include the range of response to loss model and the adult attitude to grief scale. And she's going to be discussing these today as part of her presentation. And just before Linda's presentation, I'm going to provide a quick overview of break support services, particularly about our helpline and also our work in supporting suddenly bereaved people. I'd also like to thank Virtual Blackburn Law, whose kind support and assistance has been essential in enabling us to run this webinar. So thanks very much to everyone at Virtual Blackburn. And because of them, we've been able to run this webinar as a free of charge event, which is fantastic as we're trying to engage as wide an audience as possible. So a huge thank you to them for their kind support as well. And just a bit of background, Virtual Blackburn are a law firm with offices based across the northwest of England, and they've got expertise and experience in supporting people facing a wide range of difficulties and issues. And if anyone would like some further information on them, it can be found at their website, which is www.virtualblackburn.co.uk. And Virtual Blackburn have also recently kindly extended their support of Break to sponsoring our Sudden website, where a recording of this event is going to be available later this afternoon. And I'll be emailing the link to this to all our attendees alongside a feedback form, which would be fantastic if people would be willing to fill in. So just a little bit of an overview about Break before we begin the webinar itself. Break is a road safety charity which was founded in 1995, so we're 21 years old this year. We work extensively, and our two main aims are to prevent road crashes and to support the victims of road crashes. We work extensively with communities and organisations across the UK, and we try to stop the tragedy of road deaths and injuries. And we also try and make streets and communities safe for everyone and support people who've been bereaved and seriously injured on our roads. We also work globally, and we've got Break New Zealand, which has been established for some time, and we also run some international and global projects. But tragically, in the UK, there are currently 5 deaths and 60 serious injuries on our roads every single day. Some of our key projects are Break Professional. And Break Professional is a membership scheme for fleet operators, and this scheme tries to help them improve their safety of their at-work drivers. We've got Road Safety Week, which Break founded in the UK over a decade ago. It's since become the UK's largest annual road safety engagement event. And Break now also runs the Road Safety Week in New Zealand, and we support other road safety weeks around the globe. And then there's also Sudden, which is the initiative that's responsible for this webinar. And Sudden is a charitable initiative that's been developed by Break, and we founded it to extend our expertise and knowledge in delivering support services for people who've been bereaved by road crashes, and also professional development services for those providing care, to try and extend this to all forms of sudden death. And Sudden shares best practice, research and resources among professionals across the world who work with people who are suddenly bereaved by any cause. And as part of this, we run events like these webinars to try and provide a professional development opportunity for people. And here we've just got a few events that we've got upcoming as part of Sudden. And if you'd like any more details about these, you can find some more information online at www.sudden.org, or alternatively, feel free to drop me a line at jkushner@break.org.uk. So thanks very much for that. So my presentation today is looking at how Break and Sudden can provide support to people who've been suddenly bereaved. And here on the screen we've just got some quick quotes from people showing how valuable a service our helpline is and how invaluable it's been to people who've had to use it, unfortunately. So Break's support services. Our support services aims are to enable people who've been suddenly bereaved and seriously injured in road crashes to go on to lead positive, healthy and meaningful lives. We try to emotionally support people suffering shock and grief to help them feel comforted, valued and safe. We help people understand and deal with unfamiliar and complex procedures through information provision, problem solving and advocacy. And we help people acknowledge medium to long-term mental or physical symptoms and access appropriate assessment, support and treatment. And the principles of our support services are to try and ensure that it's always victim and needs orientated, that it's clear and accessible, and it's in line with the latest thinking and best practice. And we ensure that our support must always be objective and decided through negotiation with the person who's calling our helpline. Our helpline tries and facilitate informed and supportive decision making, and it's a full quality accredited service by the Helpline Association. It's professionally delivered to the highest standard, and we aim also where possible, if we can, to work in partnership with other organisations and services to ensure that we can maximise our knowledge and ensure that the access and range of support we can offer is as wide as possible. So there are 3 key ways in which BREAK ensure that suddenly bereaved people receive the help that they need. The first way is through our literature, and also through our Sudden project, and finally through our helpline. And some of our literature is available online and downloadable as PDFs, and it's also there as a recorded source as well. So we have a wide range of support literature at BREAK. It's reviewed and written by experts and field leaders, and written in a clear and accessible style with up-to-date information. Our road crash bereavement support packs contain answers to a lot of common practical and procedural questions, and we also provide emotional support and comfort. Our literature has a huge range, and this goes from our support packs, which are the blue and green things that you can see at the bottom of your screen, and these are distributed by contacting the police in the immediate aftermath of a death or a serious injury, to our Amy and Tom books, which are designed for children. And these Amy and Tom books are colourfully illustrated, clear and accessible ways of helping children understand their strong emotions after sudden death. There's both available a road crash specific version and also one that's suitable following any form of sudden death. And for our distribution for the police, we aim for all literature to be handed out when the police are breaking the news, but ideally within 48 hours of the death or a serious injury occurring. And if anyone would be interested in seeing some of this literature, it's available at the link at the bottom of the screen, which is www.break.org.uk/victim-support. And our BREAK bereavement pack is one of the most key forms of our bereavement literature. It's updated and revised annually, and there's a full consultation of experts and practitioners on a 3-year rolling schedule, which ensures that content is always carefully considered. We also produce a handy yellow booklet entitled Coping with Grief When Someone You Love Dies Suddenly, and this offers reassurance about the feelings and emotions that people experience following sudden bereavement, and tries to reassure people that these are normal and can be expected. And it also provides tips for getting through each day and getting help from others, as well as offering information and guidance to help decide whether someone might benefit from seeking specialist help. And this booklet is available free of charge to anyone who'd be interested in it. Our Amy and Tom books are, as said before, designed for children, and they're designed for adults and children to read together. And there's 2 versions. There's the one that you can see on your screen, which is entitled Someone Has Died Suddenly, and there's also a Someone Has Died in a Road Crash specific version. The book for children who've been bereaved by a road crash is free to order from BREAK, and the book for children who've been bereaved through all forms of sudden death does have a small charge, but a reduction is available for bulk buys. So BREAK's helpline. BREAK's helpline is established for anyone in the UK who's been bereaved or seriously injured for a road crash. It's also designed to support friends, families and professionals, particularly police family liaison officers, who are supporting and working alongside these people. There's no time limit for how long people can call up or the number of calls they're allowed to have to the helpline, and the number is also a free phone, so there's no charge associated. And if we can't answer a call due to all the lines being taken, we endeavour to respond within 24 hours to a caller. And we're also very happy to provide support through email for people who might not be willing to call up. We will support people in the world regardless of wherever the crash occurred, and we work in partnership with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to provide support for those bereaved in crashes abroad. Unfortunately, we can't support drivers who caused the crash unless they themselves are bereaved or injured or witnesses to a crash. And we also can't support under 16s, although our helpline are happy to talk to any adults who are wanting advice of how to help someone who's aged under 16 who's been bereaved. And just a bit of context on this slide about why we need to provide this service. A European academic study in 1993 by the Federation of European Road Crash Victims tragically found that 90% of families who are bereaved by road crashes experience permanent decline in quality of life. This study also found that 58% of those who've been bereaved by road crash experienced subsequent health problems, and of these 64% had experienced depression and 37% were suicidal. And the organisation actually did a follow-up study in 1995, and this found that 90% of those who've been suddenly bereaved reported an inability to take pleasure in life. And this survey also found that these problems decreased only very marginally over 3 years. But however, the experience of our helpline is generally that with the right support and given time, people who are provided the correct care are able to move forward positively. However, it's very important for us to understand the complex and widespread impacts of a sudden bereavement, and I'm sure that's something that Linda's going to overview in her presentation. And our helpline often find that a sudden bereavement can have major impact and cause extreme difficulties to people's lives. And issues often reported include major lifestyle changes, particularly in people's professional and personal lives, and problematically, this can lead to a loss of earnings, further exacerbating what can be very difficult financial challenges of a sudden death. And we've often also found that there's a potential for a sudden bereavement to lead to drug and alcohol addiction, alongside other potential compulsive behaviour, problems such as family breakdown and social exclusion and isolation. And we therefore feel that it's vital for those who've been suddenly bereaved in such a horrific and traumatic manner are offered the best possible support, and we really do take pride in the service that we're able to offer. So our helpline has a wide range of services that it's able to offer, and this varies from our helpline officers who are able to talk to people on the phone for, as we said, as long as is needed, to also our I've Been There service, which is run by volunteers. So here we've just got a quick helpline case study about someone who called up a few years ago, and there's a situation of a husband who was tragically killed in a crash, leaving a wife and a 10-year-old daughter. And his wife, following the death, was subject to harassment, felt unable to work due to the traumatic nature of her bereavement, and feeling cut off, had no viable support options. And the helpline were able to offer a truly encompassing support for her. They offered advice about possible benefit claims and where she could go to get expert advice about this. They suggested ways to progress a housing move, which would also be helpful in getting rid of some of the harassment, and were also able to offer other financial assistance. And they discussed emotional support needs of the woman and offered to direct her to other forms of support and found a relative support group in the area. And here we've also got a couple of other more practical case studies in which the helpline's been able to help. And this varies from general undertaking of funding applications, which has covered things such as holidays, travel and accommodation costs. We're also able to access small helping hands funding pots that enable callers in financial hardship to do things as simple as eating well, visit family members, top up their phone and contact their family. And we also carry out extensive partnership work with other organisations, and this has led to us working alongside the Centre for Domestic Violence and a local police force, and also arranging some suicide prevention respite day. And our dedication to trying to provide as wide and encompassing support as possible has even led to us doing things such as providing equine therapy. And as our helpline, we take pride in being able to offer tailored support for people who call up. Our helpline always aims to offer this tailored support for whatever our callers' needs are, and our helpline offer research and advocacy skills to find support that's tailored to personal needs. The service can identify and put callers in touch with professional and healthcare support, such as trauma therapy, counselling, support groups, and other things such as this that are able to offer people the support they require. And through this support, the helpline will remain in contact for as long as is necessary and helpful for the caller. And it's just all just about making sure that support is as wide and encompassing as possible and ensuring that people are able to move forward positively. And our I've Been There service is a great way that we're able to engage with some of our people who've actually previously called up the helpline. It's a facilitated call between a break volunteer and a caller who suffered a similar bereavement or injury. It's monitored by a break helpline officer who remains silent on the line but is available to offer support and intervention if necessary and ensure that the call remains on the right track. And it's an opportunity for the caller to speak to someone who's experienced a similar trauma in their life but has been able to move forward from it positively, and to be able to perhaps compare some of those early stages of bereavement and talk about how they were able to move on from it. And one thing that we are finding with the helpline is that we get busier and busier each year. In 2015, our helpline saw a 14% increase in the number of road crash cases supported, and this was an estimated 588 cases supported by the end of 2015. We saw a 19% increase in the number of victims supported, and this was an estimated 516 by the end of 2015. And we saw a 21% increase in the number of professionals that we worked alongside with, and this is an increase of 21% to 684. And just here we've got some quotes from people who've called up the helpline just so you can see what an impact this helpline service is able to have. And just to finish off, I'm going to provide some information about the Sudden Initiative. It's an initiative that's run by Break, sharing global best practice, research and resources amongst professionals and carers. We run events such as these, and we also do training sessions for victim support professionals and also police officers, and our website contains resources both for bereaved people and carers and victim support professionals, such as our books and also some of our online guidance reports. So thanks very much to everyone for listening, and I'm now going to hand over to our presenter, Dr. Linda Machin. So I'm just going to take Linda off mute mode, and I'm going to put you on your webcam as well, Linda.
Hello there.
Hi, Linda.
Hello.
Can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can indeed.
I'm going to change you over to the presenter position now.
Fine.
Have you got your slides up and prepared? I've now made you presenter.
Okay.
That's great, we can see you now.
Okay. So welcome everyone this afternoon, and I hope that this presentation will be helpful for you. I will pause briefly between each of the sections so that if you want to frame a question, then you can do so. So the themes that I'm going to present this afternoon are the landscape of loss, looking very much at the broader themes of how we come to experience loss in our lives, understanding grief, the range of response to loss model, mapping grief, working with bereaved people looking at a professional perspective, and being a good friend to the bereaved. So the first of these sections, the landscape of loss. What are the features of life landscape when we think about loss? From our birth to our childhood, adults to death, we are subject to all sorts of experiences that find themselves connected through relationships, but bounded also by socio-economic and cultural backgrounds. And within this warp and weft of human experience, we will have health issues that may cause losses. We may have dreams and hopes that are dashed that will cause losses. And we will have death, which may not come at the end of a long life, but may come suddenly, unexpectedly, and traumatically. So this is a picture of how we might see our lives and the place of loss within it. In childhood, the joys and pains of learning and living, and we would hope the children may have that very delightful exploring and wondered state of experience, whether that's out in nature or in relationships. But we know that life is not always like that, and there are tears, sorry, I need to go back. There are tears, and that too needs to be shared. So what does living teach us as we're growing up? About love, about trust and risk, about disappointment, about ourselves in relation to other people. All of these experiences of loss will teach us something about these things. Adults too, gaining and losing. Through it we can acquire emotional intelligence, the capacity to deal with losses. Or we may be so accustomed to disguise ourselves to others that we become disguised to ourselves and close down. Growing old with beginnings and endings, and we tend to think of that typically as being a sad position. But we know that for many people, still living the good moments is a possibility in old age. So loss and change are central to life experience. Dealing with the little losses is a rehearsal for coping with the bigger ones. And I think sometimes we feel we ought to protect children from losses and experiences of hurt and disappointment. And yet in the same way that we might inoculate them against a disease and provide into their system a small amount of a disease in order to make them stronger and more resistant, I think we also need to think about the ways in which children can experience those things and be strengthened by them. Grief can be activated by any loss and change, not just bereavement. So that whole range of things I mentioned a moment ago may all produce a grief response. But we have to remember we have the capacity not to be crushed by loss and change, and resilience is part of our human heritage. I'm going to pause just for a minute so that if you feel you would like to jot down a question, you can do that. So the second section, understanding grief. There are a number of key grief theories that provide us with a lot of wide-ranging insight and understanding into grief. And I'm just going to mention some of those that are very important to those people who work in this area of bereavement support. I'm clicking rather too vigorously here. First of all, attachment theory. We know of the work of John Bowlby, who gave us all those insights into what happens when people are attached through relationships and when those relationships come to an end. And that became very foundational work in the 20th century to help us to understand what loss is like. More recently, the dual process model is one that has become very familiar with bereavement workers. And here the challenge was to some of the traditional work that will begin to think not just about loss orientation, but the whole question of restoration, how we become adjusted to the consequences of a loss and bereavement. And the capacity to move between that loss orientation and restoration orientation provides us with a very key sense of bringing potential resilience to our experience. And then the tasks of mourning. This moves away very much from the traditional view about stages of grief to give us a sense of what are some of the tasks that people have to undertake when they're grieving. Accepting the loss to begin with, which can be very difficult, particularly if the loss has occurred in traumatic circumstances. Being able to process the pain that's associated with the loss. Being able to find the means of readjusting to life without the person who has died. And eventually shaping that life, not cut off from the deceased and memories of them, but integrating them into a new life experience. And then risk. Sanders has written a lot about the things that produce risk when someone is bereaved. And we can see here that those people who are attending this webinar will be interested in the risk that comes from sudden and traumatic death, and undoubtedly that is something that is produced by, that is one of the risk factors we need to think about. We need to know that also another risk factor is parental bereavement. And one of the hardest things to cope with is the death of a child. The state of health of the bereaved person before the event of the loss can also be significant. If physical or mental health reduces their capacity to deal with the loss. So there's a lot more on risk if people want to explore that, because it's another part of the picture of the theories of grief. So continuing bonds. There was a view at some point that the end of grieving was to move on and almost turn one's back on the events of loss. But the theory around continuing bonds shows us that in fact there is a continuity, albeit in a different kind of way, but there is nothing inappropriate or morbid about people's connection with the past, and there's no evidence that that is indicative of a poor outcome. Meaning reconstruction can sound rather a grand title, but part of what we have to do when we experience a significant loss is suddenly to have to look at the things that have been meaningful in our life and maybe adjust them in the light of what has been lost. And that is perhaps one of the most significant tasks of the bereaved, to be able to find new meaning in a situation particularly that has been very traumatic and untimely. But lastly, to think about the question of resilience, we need to remember that the human capacity for resilience is very strong, and perhaps we only have to look at some of the current pictures of the refugees who have the most horrendous experiences of loss of home, of life, of family, to see that somehow their determination and sometimes their smiles indicate the resilience of the human being. So for the individual, what is the impact and what are the influences of grief? We tend to think of grief predominantly as an emotion, and of course that is very true, but we also know that it has a physical impact too, and many people will be registering all sorts of psychosomatic illness or the increase in the current illness that they're suffering, and the body is an important thermometer, if you like, of what's going on in the grief. The mind, we sometimes forget that part of what is happening to us is that we're thinking very intensively about all the things that have happened in this event of loss, and as people will often say, I'm trying to get my head around it, which is saying in colloquial language, I'm thinking about it and my mind is central to this impact of loss. And then there is the spiritual aspect, and this is irrespective of whether people have an overtly religious perspective, but is something about people's questions about the wider meaning of life. And then that of behaviour, as already mentioned in the introduction, sometimes people can resort to inappropriate modifications to their loss by excessive drinking or drug taking, or even antisocial behaviours which can be associated with the impact of the loss. And what are the influences? Social networks. If we have strong social networks, then we can be very supported in our grief and bereavement. If our network is very small, then we might feel very isolated in the grief. And culture. We think quite rightly of our nation as multicultural, and people bring very different insights, support mechanisms to the process of the experience of grief. And the life perspectives, attitudes, we'll be thinking about attitudes shortly, life perspectives is something that combines those experiences we have of loss and those cultural and social things that support us in loss. And so understanding sudden and traumatic loss. Bereavement caused by sudden or traumatic death swiftly changes our psychological equilibrium, that sense of well-being that may normally be part of our personality, and it may result in anxiety or depression. A sense of security and the taken for granted predictability of life is something that we also have to look at with a sudden death. All those things that we were sure about, and we could plan our lives on the assumption that certain things would always happen, is changed suddenly in a sudden and traumatic experience of loss. It changes family and social relationships, with the need for giving and receiving support. The way people interact with each other may be different from the way they interact ordinarily. And sometimes there can be a lot of tension in family groups because people are grieving differently and are looking for different kinds of solace. Changes in practical day-to-day life. Normal functioning may have to be put on hold for a temporary period, or even longer interruptions may result from economic insecurity or legal processes. So if the consequences of the death puts the stability of the finances of the family in jeopardy, then that is going to disrupt and change the situation very dramatically. There are changes through belief systems and the meaning they give to life. Sometimes to have a particular belief may provide a renewed sense of comfort, or else it may be found wanting and there is a challenge to what had previously been believed. And there's a change perhaps in the normal coping mechanisms we have, the way we think, the way we decide, the way we act, may all become problematic. We may somehow become stuck and unable to function in the way we normally do. And it changes the sense of the future, it changes what we can plan for and the security we can feel in looking to the future. So this is a little bit about the theories of grief, the impact on the individual, and thinking particularly about sudden and traumatic loss. So again, I'll pause for a moment before I go on to the next section.
Hi everyone, I'd just like to remind everyone that if you do have any questions, please do type them into the box, and I'm very happy to pass them on to Linda. I was just wondering personally, it sounds like a lot of things that provide support to people previously and can be their normal coping mechanisms, so family, friends, religion, lots of things like this can break down. And in that sort of case, how do you think it's best to support someone where what they've previously relied on has then perhaps disappeared from them, or they don't put that trust in it anymore?
Well, I think one of the ways in which we may need to compensate for that is to look at the whole family group and support people, sometimes as individuals, to understand what's happening to other people as well as themselves, so that they can be understanding of each other, and then perhaps to work with a family group in order to explore how they need to put into place the things that perhaps have always been there but suddenly seem not to be functioning. So there may, in some circumstances, of course, it may be necessary for people to be looking for outside agencies such as yours to make good some of that support, particularly in the initial period of the loss.
That's really interesting. And We've had a question coming in asking about social media pages, but I suppose on a wider perspective, do you think that memories and things that bring back memories of people, such as a social media page and things like that, the question is, can that cause more grief than is necessary if a social media page isn't closed down immediately after a death?
I don't know a huge amount about this from first hand, but my guess is that, as with many of these situations, sometimes it will be very helpful to people, and at other times they will want to close down on that. And perhaps I can pick that up in a minute when I look at the next section and look at how people do differently cope with grief. So I would think in so many of these situations there's no one-size-fits-all answer to these questions. I think what is necessary is perhaps for people to be clear about what they want and determine if they're key to the bereavement, to make clear that that is what they want, and to seek the cooperation of people who may not be quite seeing it in the same way.
Sure. And if you're happy, we've also had another question come through, if it'd be okay to answer that one.
Yes, that's fine. I'm just aware time's pushing on, but yes, that's fine.
It's, how do you deal with the anger of traumatic loss?
I wonder whether I can we hold that question, because I'm going to talk about anger in a minute or two, and I think it may become a bit clearer how we can deal with anger. So I'm not wanting to dodge it, but I think I can put it in the context of some of the next sections I'm going to look at. Okay.
Yeah, that's great.
You remind me at the end if I haven't dealt with it satisfactorily. Is that okay?
That's great, and I'll hand over back to you now.
Okay. So the range of response to loss model is a model of grief that's emerged in my own work through both practice and research, and has come through observing and listening and studying people's reactions and responses to loss. And what I've observed, first of all, sorry, I'm rushing on, there are individual differences, but there can be patterns to our loss. And this range of response to loss model was developed as a framework to capture individual differences and patterns, so that we can look at both of these things, how people are different, but the ways in which there are similarities. So first of all, overwhelmed by grief. People who are saying, I can't cope. My world is in pieces. Everything has changed for the worse. I can't think about anything except losing whoever it is. We know that picture, that sense of deep distress. I feel upset all of the time. So we can see that picture of the overwhelmed group, which will often come to those who are offering support services to the bereaved. But then there's the staying in control response. You just have to get on with life. I need to be strong for my family. I don't need to keep thinking and talking about the deceased. I've got too many things to do to feel sorry for myself. So this is in a total contrast to the overwhelmed person, who may not so readily seek help unless some of these strategies for getting on with life don't work for them. But then there's the person who finds a balance between being overwhelmed and being in control. I know there are people there to help me. It's okay to be sad. It takes time to get over the death of someone you're close to. I believe I can cope with life after the deceased's death, even though it's hard. So here we can see a balance between acknowledging the pain, but also seeing how I might be able to function, particularly with the support of other people. And so the model grew from looking at those three kinds of reactions to grief. And on a spectrum from overwhelm to control, we could see this as a set of reactions that people have to their bereavement. And the balancing or resilient position is the one that somehow embraces part of both of those reactions. Now, I was not wanting to compete with some of the influential theorists who talked about grief. But I was very clear at an early stage that people understood the terms I was using because they are terms overwhelmed and controlled that people themselves use. It's not a theoretical language. And I needed to compare this with two of the key theories, attachment theory and the dual process model. And if we think about overwhelmed reactions, we can see that that fits with the theory of anxious and ambivalent attachment styles and with the loss orientation of the dual process model. With the controlled reactions, we can see that that fits with an avoidant attachment style and with a restoration orientation. Resilient one we can see equates with a secure attachment style and with a capacity to oscillate or move between loss and restoration orientation. That gave some comfort that what I was talking about resonates with other significant theory. Then there have been some developments in this model. And clearly, if there is a capacity to balance the overwhelmed and controlled reactions, there must also be a partner response, which is vulnerability and incapacity to balance those things. And so it became a two-dimensional model with core grief reactions and on a scale from overwhelmed to controlled, and coping responses on a scale from vulnerable to resilient. So the reactions we have, which are almost undertaken as unconscious reactions, are feelings of sadness, despair, guilt, anger. Come to that again a bit later. A sense of disbelief, of powerlessness, injustice. Thoughts are often confused and contradictory, and behaviour may be either very passive when people feel they have no energy to do anything, or very overactive when they busily engage with lots of life demands. In contrast, coping responses are undertaken much more consciously. And they're an attempt to regulate our emotion, to decide when it's appropriate to express it and when it's appropriate to repress it. Adjusting to changed relationships, finding a new way without the husband or wife, or the son or the daughter. What does that mean for me as an individual and for our family as a group? It takes time and people have to cope with that. Adjusting to change social realities. So the world you inhabited with the person who's now died may be very different. You may no longer be able to have those holidays. You may no longer have someone who can do the housekeeping and look after the children. So we can see there will be lots of ways in which there is a coping response that needs to be made to those changes. And then we have to make sense of loss, something that I will keep coming back to. We have to understand what it is and weave it into the fabric of our own personal life philosophy. So, what are the factors that influence coping? There are the messages that we grow up with. that very classic message of big boys don't cry can be very powerful, both in the simple message and all the implications of that, for telling people, particularly men I guess, that they need to be strong and not show emotion. Or conversely, there may be the little girl who has always felt to be the princess and beyond being her and needs to be protected from it. So there are some core messages that will go with our upbringing that will tell us something about how we should cope with loss and grief. And then there is our observation. We will look at other people dealing with loss and grief. And in a way, this is why children, importantly, need to be embraced in the family when something difficult happens, because they learn by observing. And then personal experience too, which will shape how we understand and see a current loss in the light of losses we've had in the past. And then the circumstances in which we lose, those sudden, unexpected happenings, such as a road accident, sudden death through a heart attack, will bring a great sense of risk to the coping process. The personal risk that may be about, as we mentioned before, health issues, dependence on the person perhaps who's died, will all play into that. And the interpersonal risk, again, is about relationships and how they function. And if they don't function well, then that's a problem. And we'll look at that in a bit more detail too. And then there's the attitude that we bring to coping with loss. We all know those people who will understand their experience of loss as something that is a glass half empty, and will dwell very much on the empty component, whereas for other people the glass half full may be very much about the sense of things that have gone well and happy memories and so on. So the factors which contribute to vulnerability and bereavement, those circumstantial factors: unexpected death, untimely death, horrific death, multiple losses, stigmatized death such as suicide, concurrent stresses such as caring for others or financial problems, personal risks, insecure attachment with the deceased, young children, adolescents, physical and psychological problems, or a past history of difficulty in coping with stressful situations. And interpersonal risk, either a lack of support or someone who makes poor use of support for the loss of a child. They will all contribute to this sense of vulnerability in responding to bereavement. So some of the characteristics of vulnerability are limited personal resourcefulness. Someone who's not flexible, maybe they can't be for physical reasons, someone who's inflexible or has low self-esteem. A negative life perspective, they're pessimistic, and are unable to make sense of the loss. And limited social embeddedness, a lack of support, or unable to access support. In contrast, resilience is about personal resourcefulness with flexibility, courage, perseverance, and a sense of worth. A positive life perspective, optimistic, and capacity to make sense of the loss. And social embeddedness, support is available and the person can access this. That's a little bit about understanding that warp and weft of grief reactions on a scale from overwhelmed to controlled, and the coping responses on a scale of vulnerability to resilience. So again, I'll just pause for a minute for any either incoming questions or questions to be given at the end.
And the question of anger and sudden bereavement. What do you think the best ways to support someone are, or is that something you might like to address later in the webinar?
I'll address it a bit later when we're talking about responding to the bereaved, but just to say that although a controlled reaction to bereavement is often about suppressing feelings, the one feeling that can go with control is anger, because anger masquerades as control. We've only got to think about people in a fairly everyday situation who are rendered powerless by something that happens to them. They're frustrated by something and they will become angry, and they're not necessarily the sort of people who would normally show emotion. So yeah, anger can be very much something that goes with that sense of wanting to be in control, of actually feeling that you're the master of the situation rather than at the mercy of it. But I'll certainly pick it up again a bit later, but it's useful just to comment on that.
And okay, just had another question. Saying, yes. Very interesting to hear about how perhaps perceived gender roles might have an impact on how people grieve and how they show their emotions. And do you think that's something that's perhaps changing at all in modern society, or do you think that there still are quite strong preconceptions of how people should show their feelings?
Well, I guess it's not necessarily how they should, although that may come from the messages that we receive. I think there certainly is a change. I think the kind of closing down on feelings for everybody, perhaps at the time of the First World War, when there was such mass loss of life, and it was very important to keep a community without persisting grief. And I think people closed down a lot, and that persisted very much through the 20th century. But I think we do now see a much greater capacity for men to be able to express their feelings. And it's changing, but I guess there's a lot more work to be done on it.
Absolutely. I'll hand back over to you.
Okay. So let's think about mapping grief. How can we begin within that broad spectrum of the range of response to loss, which is a theoretical compass for thinking about grief? How can we begin to map grief of the individual? So I devised the Adult Attitude to Grief Scale, first of all, as a research tool to test the validity of the items I've described in the model, particularly the overwhelmed, the controlled, and the resilient. And this is how the actual scale looks. Sorry, yeah, this is how it applies to the scale. Sorry about that. So here we have the range of response to loss, and the items that go with the overwhelmed look at the disturbingly intrusive nature of grief, the unremittingly painful experience, and the fact that it can rob life of meaning. Whereas the controlled perspective is one that values stoicism. There is a denial of or a covering of distress and a focus on day-to-day living. And the resilient responses, courage in facing a loss, a sense of personal resourcefulness and hopefulness. Now you'll be aware that these were the three elements in the model at the beginning, and I will go on to look at how vulnerability can be explored in the light of that addition to the model. Look at that a bit later. So a tool for practice So these are the actual items on the scale, the overwhelmed ones, and the numbers indicate where they fit on the scale because they're mixed, they're not categorized into themes as I have categorized them here. For me, it's difficult to switch off thoughts about the person I have lost. I feel that I will always carry the pain of grief with me. Life has less meaning for me after this loss. In the controlled items, I believe that I must be brave in the face of loss. For me, it's important to keep my grief under control, and I think it's best just to get on with life and not dwell on this loss. And the resilient items, I feel able to face the pain which comes with loss. I feel very aware of my inner strength when faced with grief. It may not always feel like it, but I do believe I will come through this experience of grief. And again, the vulnerability, how we will be looking at that is, in fact, to add together the scores we have for the overwhelmed and controlled responses, and we include the resilient responses, but reverse those scores in order to achieve a sense of the level of vulnerability. So what I saw in that piece of research, which was testing the notions in the model, was that although it did that, it also looked like it could be a very useful practice tool, because what we were seeing was the capacity of people to mix and match their responses across all those 9 items and provide a very individual profile of their grief, which in terms of being able to help people is very important. So the proposed formula that I mentioned a moment ago for identifying vulnerability is that the core grief responses are combined, and that the coping responses are added in reverse order in order to give an indication of vulnerability. Overwhelmed plus control, reversed resilience gives vulnerability. And I hope that makes sense, that when people are overwhelmed or control isn't working for them, they're clearly vulnerable. And people who are showing that they are resilient are clearly not vulnerable, but if they disagree with the items in the scale, then this will demonstrate vulnerability. And everyone has a chance to answer those questions on a scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree. So again, there you will see the score runs from 4 to 0 for the overwhelmed to controlled, and 0 to 4 for the vulnerability. And it's unnecessary to do the actual theoretical calculation if you're using it in practice and have this template for looking at the scores of a client. So the scores run from 0 to 36, and our research showed that those with a score of higher than 24 were severely vulnerable. Those from 21 to 23 were highly vulnerable, and below 20 was low vulnerability. So identifying some factors which produce vulnerability, and this came from our research when we were wanting to validate the adult attitude to grief as a tool to be used in vulnerability. What we saw in that sample of people who participated in that research was that people under 25 and over 76 were particularly vulnerable. That in terms of grief reactions, if there was an inability to accept the death, very powerful distress or despair, and difficulty in day-to-day functioning, again, that would be a sign of vulnerability. and the coping responses where people have problems dealing with their own feelings or dealing with the meaning of loss, again, another sign of vulnerability. Complicating factors, mental health problems, and finance, and social isolation. So these are some of the things that came together when we were looking at the adult attitude to grief, first as a research tool, but then as something that would provide us with a very varied and nuanced way of looking at the individual grief of someone who is presenting for support in their bereavement. So again, I'll just pause for a moment and see if there are any questions or issues that you want to raise about the adult attitude to grief scale.
We've had a question in that's not perhaps quite so related to the scale, but it's, does traumatic loss usually require counselling at some time during the grieving pathway?
My sense is, and I want to say no, it doesn't. I think we've somehow reached within our Western culture a view that anything that's slightly difficult needs to be counselled about. And I think that is actually moving against understanding the resilience of people and moving against understanding that every one of us in our day-to-day capacity can be of support. I do accept that if someone has had an experience of traumatic bereavement, there may at some time perhaps be a need for support outside the normal networks, but I think that need necessarily be very long term but not shorter term. So I think again we look at the individuals, but we don't leap in and imagine everyone needs that in order to cope effectively.
That's really interesting, thank you. Hand back over.
I'll move on then. So working with the bereaved at a professional perspective, I think what we are faced with is a person who finds themselves suddenly lost, confused, unsure, perplexed, disorientated, all of those things, particularly if the bereavement has been sudden and traumatic. And we may see those people who find themselves in a very bleak kind of place, away from the kinds of support they would want and only facing the bleakness of their situation. So what we may be wanting to look at is combining that sense of being lost and not knowing the way through, the little figure at the bottom there, with a compass, finding some direction that will be helpful to the bereaved. So what is the aim of bereavement care in whatever form it takes? To be the most effective, interventions must be tailored to the uniqueness of the person. So you'll understand why in terms of the last question that was posed, I couldn't necessarily give a definitive answer. I would want to say that for some people, yes, they would need very intensive help. For other people, it would be a very light touch support that they would need. We need to tailor it to the relationship with the deceased. We've already seen that to lose a child is a particularly traumatizing experience. We need to understand what kind of relationship this was with the deceased. Sometimes there's a lot more unpacking to be done if it's been an unhappy relationship and suddenly the death has occurred with all sorts of unfinished business about quarrels or disagreements or more profound difficulties in relationships. We need to understand the circumstances of the loss, and the focus particularly today is sudden and traumatic loss. Just being able to imagine as we engage with the person who's lost what indeed that must have been like, and some of the physical realities of those circumstances too, which in themselves can be traumatizing, as well as the death itself. And the circumstances of a bereaved person, how well resourced are they as an individual, and how well supported are they from other people. So we need to look at how to be effective with what we're doing and look at this uniqueness at a specific moment, grieving a specific loss. And things will change over time, and one of the things we find by using the adult attitude to grief scale when people are being helped is to use it periodically during the helping process, or certainly at the end, and to have evidence of the way in which the person has moved on. But at the initial point, we need to look at this specific moment and this specific loss. So, methods of assessment. We can use that range of response to loss as a kind of compass to understand which of those dimensions I talked about may be significant to the person. Or we can use the adult attitude to grief as a kind of map to begin to accumulate the data that's pertinent to the individual. And we're appraising those core grief reactions, looking at how overwhelmed and how controlled a person might be. And we must imagine that people are either one or the other. Clearly, when we are balanced, we're a bit of both. But when we are vulnerable, the people who are controlled are struggling very hard, perhaps with emotions that are defeating their capacity to remain in control. So we need to look at that dimension. The coping responses, the vulnerable to the resilient, how are people dealing with that? And what is the level of vulnerability? These are all things on the model that I've described we can use as tools of assessment. And then part of this is facilitating the story of loss, exploring how grief is both being experienced and expressed through the story that's told. What happened, when and how? Narrative therapy, we see that as the external narrative, the details of what happened. The impact of the loss on the teller. What is this doing? What is this event of loss doing for the person who is telling us about their bereavement and grief? And begin to explore a new perspective on loss. That won't come right at the beginning, but will be something to begin to think about, helping people to move forward and maybe look differently at some of the things they perceived at the beginning of that experience. Exploring the uniqueness of the bereaved person through the range of response to loss model. So if we look at the model and see it as a compass, we can see that someone who's overwhelmed and vulnerable will be someone whose feelings of grief dominate and make day-to-day life difficult. Whereas somebody who's vulnerable but in control, there will be a denial of the grief and a struggle with the reality of the loss. There's a sort of fragile function, holding on by the fingertips. And as I mentioned earlier, there may be a lot of anger in this particular reaction. And then the overwhelmed and resilient, I still use the sense of the overwhelmed because strong emotions will not go away, but they are accepted as part of the loss experience. They can begin to be understood. There isn't battle going on with the feelings that are being experienced. And then the effective engagement with the reality of loss and being able to get on with life. These are some of the things, some of the characteristics we can look at when working with bereaved people. And we need to look at those external things too, the debilitating personal and circumstantial factors that will add to vulnerability. And similarly, the enabling personal and circumstantial factors which will assist resilience. So I want to spend just a few moments thinking about if we use the adult attitude with measure, how do we actually use it in practice? We need to explain to the person why we are using it. It may be that a service uses it as a standard form of assessment, or it may be that the practitioner has decided that this would be a helpful thing to do. So we need to explain that to the client or the help seeker. We need to describe the purpose, and it's to give a clear picture of what grief is like. And that can help both the practitioner, the support person, to understand the nature of the grief, but it can also help to clarify what this often confused state is for the client. And so often there are contradictions in our grieving that will emerge from the responses to the scale, and that's part of the jagged edges of grief that make it particularly difficult. So in our experience of using it, people have found it particularly helpful, and it sometimes can help normalize grief. People can say, oh, you know, this is something that is perfectly normal. It isn't a sign that I am going mad. So give a copy of the scale to the client and explain how to use it with the 5 options beside each of the 9 items. And assure the person that there are no right or wrong answers. Their answers are their own, and that is very important for them to understand and accept. And also, although we're filling in a form that has a scale and a score, it's important to encourage the client or the help seeker to say more about each of the items as a way of increasing their understanding of the individual experience. So we're looking at quantitative scores but qualitative comments. So it becomes a conversation piece between the help seeker and the help giver. So the vulnerability indicator score, it's important not to show a version of the scale with a scoring system to the client, because that will automatically have people thinking it's a test or there is a right or wrong answer. But the actual scores are more as guidance for the practitioner to understand the kind of level of need and the sort of help that needs to be put in place. So when the adult attitude to grief scale has been completed, discussing with the client how it felt using the scale, whether there were particular items which stood out as being significant or troubling to him, for the help giver to feedback on the evident bias towards being overwhelmed, controlled, or resilient, and feedback on the tensions and the contradictions between those things. So a discussion afterwards about how it felt, and again the experience has been that people have felt that this is a very useful medium to explore their grieving and very helpful for practitioners to have a picture of clients' grief. And then use the evidence from the adult attitude to grief scale to determine the kind of support that is most appropriate to aid the practitioner and the client in setting goals. What kind of things do people want for their support? To evaluate the progress, I mentioned this earlier, it can be used at several points during the help process to see how things are changing, and can be an important tool for use in supervision, and to evaluate outcome at the end. So looking at the assessment as an appraisal of the level of client need. So for most people, we will see that for the score of 20 or less, a normal grief reaction requiring family support, information about the nature of grief, and perhaps community resources. For those who are in that group of 21 to 23, there will be some difficulties in coping with feelings or functioning that requires short-term, one-to-one or group support. And then for those who score above 24, more complex grief requiring skilled intervention. So what kind of skills are needed to put those three levels into practice? Most people will need that lower level, and the help given needs to be by someone who is aware that grief is normal and how and where to access services in order to convey that to the client, signposting if need be to additional help, the Citizens Advice Bureau, or legal help, etc. Some people will need the skills of someone with knowledge of grief and basic skills in assessment, listening and empathy. And for a few, expert knowledge and skills, clinical experience and qualification will be what is required. So let's just think about a guide to intervention. Back to our compass. First of all, if we're dealing with vulnerability, we need to focus on external things that are problematic. It may not simply be looking at the grief, looking at what happened and when, and understanding some of the things that clients may want to know, particularly about an accident, how it happened, who helped, etc. And then to focus on countering distressing emotions by strategies for thinking and functioning. So the person who is overwhelmed by their grief needs to be heard and understood in that mode, but then helped to think and therefore function more adequately in day-to-day life. In contrast, if we focus on countering the need to be in control, then part of what we need to do is managing and finding a safe way to address emotions. That crossover, in a sense, in order to bring some sense of balance. And it's been seen in a number of pieces of research that people who are loss-orientated or feelings are very high and overwhelming benefit from a focus on thinking and acting, whereas those who are naturally into a restoration mode or into functioning benefit most from beginning to be able to look at and understand emotion. And then if we move on to think about resilience, look at what it is in the person's life and circumstances that perhaps innately gives them some strength. And maybe we need to check that out anyway to see if that is something that suggests here is someone who doesn't need a lot of support. So the focus here is on the capacity to accept the emotions which are part of a loss experience, to move into being accepting of oneself and the feelings that go with them, and then to focus on effective thinking and behaving in response to the loss. So the anger will subside and there will be a much more rational way of looking at day-to-day life. But what we also need to see is that those feelings and that function, the overwhelmed and controlled, will be brought together. It won't be an either-or thing. They will be brought together to demonstrate resilience. So, working with vulnerable coping, where there is evidence of vulnerability, we do need to look at those circumstances, the nature of death, the relationship to the person who died, and the social situation of the bereaved. They're present in the historical, mental and physical health issues, and begin to shift the focus to resilient coping, thinking about resourcefulness, thinking about making good use of social support, thinking about harnessing the natural strength of the person in question. And nurturing resilience, focus on the capacity for resilience by exploring what skills are needed to balance feeling and functioning. How do we need to regulate our emotion? I'll come back to the anger thing in a minute. Balancing feeling and functioning. Attending to unfinished business, which is particularly a big issue when there has been a sudden or traumatic death. The things that weren't said that would have liked to have been said. The practical things that were unfinished because of an untimely death. These need to be attended to. Helping people make best use of social support, because however much an intervening counselling and support agency can be, it's how people use support in their daily life that becomes very crucial. And re-evaluating the experience of loss and seeking a satisfactory sense of meaning. So just to pick up this sense of anger, anger goes very much with being powerless, having a sense of being powerless. And it seems to me that once we begin to enable people to see the areas in which they have got power, power to choose, how to decide things, how to know perhaps what they didn't know, then some of that need for anger may become far less. I've certainly seen in situations in the past in my own practice where people have come with a tremendous grievance, perhaps against a doctor or someone in the health services, and they come with an agenda about making complaints and so on. And yet very often when you have listened to the anger and they have understood that you recognise how difficult this is, how powerless they feel, and you begin to explore how they think it might have been different, how things could have been done differently. Are those realistic things to expect or not? And the conversation and the exploration can begin to unfold in a way that takes away the keenness of anger. And again, in my experience, many of those people at the end say, well, I realise perhaps people did the best they could, and there isn't really a cause for complaint. It was my own sense of being robbed of the person who died and feeling very angry because of that. So I think it's gently hearing it and understanding it as an expression of powerlessness. After all, in our early lives we can see the tantrums of toddlers being about the frustration they feel very often in having to do what they don't want to do. And this can carry on into our adult life and our sense of powerlessness. So I'm just going to stop there for a minute, and I'm aware we're coming up to the end, but there is another short section that I want to share with people if that's possible.
Oh, we're absolutely fine for time, Linda, if you're happy to continue.
Yep, that's fine.
Brilliant. I've just had a question come through, if you'd be happy to answer one.
Yes, that's fine.
It's, have you looked at Kenneth Doka's work on different grieving styles?
Yes, I have. Yes, I have. And he talks about, let me get this right, it's instrumental grieving, and again, the Doka one follows, I mean, I couldn't map all of those other theories, but the Doka style maps onto this as well. this sense of emotive grieving and instrumental grieving. So yes, I have come across it, and I'm just in the context of this event looking at how that connects.
Oh, that's very interesting. And I've had another question in about the adult attitude to grief scale.
Yes.
It's just asking about, in your experience, what time scale do you tend to see changes on the scale?
I think this would depend very much, it's going back again to being very clear that we're talking about individual and individual circumstances. Many services offer an initial contract for perhaps 6 sessions, and you might expect to be seeing change within that period. For other people who are much more vulnerable and at the apex of that need triangle that I described earlier on, then we'd be talking about a much longer period. And some of the work in America by Catherine Shear on working with complex grief will see that people will need perhaps 16 sessions before they can begin to come through some very complex grief needs. So again, it's very variable, and it may depend very much on the service you provide. I know some services will use it after 6 sessions to decide whether the person needs more help or whether indeed that is an end point, and they feel confident that the resilience has grown to a point where they can indeed feel confident that the person can carry on with the support they've got in their own setting.
I think that's something that we found very much through our helpline, that the amount of support and the amount of time that people want to call for really does vary quite a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. So shall I continue with the last bit?
Yeah, definitely. I'll just mute ourselves.
Okay, so clearly what I've just been talking about are some of the things which would need a lot greater elaboration in terms of the professional input. But then there's a question of how can we be a good friend to the bereaved? And I think we need to engage with the bereaved person and bring what in counselling terms is a person-centred perspective by being empathic, accepting them however they are, and congruent, being real to ourselves too. This way of being with the client that's very receptive and very acknowledging and valuing them as an individual. And then by focusing on their story of loss and how they're told by the bereaved person. Is this story told with great distress, or is it told with the sort of control that said, I don't really want to get into feelings? So we can begin to get a sense of how this person expresses their grief and perhaps how we can best connect with them. So what might help? Being present and available. This is for all of us in a community setting or a family setting where we might experience this sort of traumatic event. Being present and being available. Sometimes it's incredibly hard. We all want to do something, and sometimes the best we can be is just to be with people and not to be offering premature help to them. Listening attentively and sincerely. And this is especially true if they're expressing a kind of grief that would be very different from us if it was happening in our life. So not to be correcting people or suggesting that the way they're doing it is maybe not how it should be, because it doesn't quite fit with how we might be doing it. So respect and patience, the way the bereaved person experiences and expresses their grief, in a sense collapsing those earlier 2 ones. Really respect the person for what is happening to them, and they will soon perceive just this listening as very helpful. You may want to take the initiative in suggesting social activities, particularly if you're a friend or you're on the fringe of the social life of this bereaved person, just tentatively being able to say, would you like to come to such and such an event with me? And if the person refuses, don't be put off asking in the future. Just know that the time isn't quite right for them. Offer practical help, but don't take over. Again, one of our urges to be helpful can be to do things. And it can be a classic situation where people say, don't worry, I will see to all that. And I've heard many bereaved say, in addition to losing the person who died, I lost my own integrity because other people wanted to do the things that I felt I wanted to do and would have liked to have done. Mention the name of the deceased in conversation where it's natural to do so. It can be so easy for it to seem like we're saving people distress by not talking about the person who's died. And yet that will be going on in the interior world of the bereaved, whether we mention it or not. So to be comfortable mentioning the person who's died is very important. Showing that you care by maintaining support over time, because grieving can take a long time. And particularly even when people seem to be reasonably okay and getting on with life reasonably well, things like birthdays and anniversaries and Christmas and holiday times when everybody's going away and doing happy things can be especially difficult, and that can go on for a very long time. So there are lots of things that we can do by gently being with the person, honouring them, valuing them, doing practical things where it's appropriate, negotiate with them. Would it help for me to do whatever? I think assess against that. When people say, I'm here to help, just give me a call, often the bereaved person hasn't got the energy to give a call. So we do need to offer tentatively. So hopefully these are some ways in which we might help. And sharing the pain, we sometimes need to do that holding a hand, one-to-one. We need to do it sometimes by embracing a wider group of people hurt by a bereavement. We need to include people into the ordinary, everyday fabric of social life. And these are all contexts in which we will need to show our concern and care of the bereaved. So it's individual, it's family and friends, it's community, it's all of those things where we can touch the lives of the bereaved. And then for ourselves, we don't do this work unscathed. It touches us if we remain sensitive to the needs of the bereaved. And so finding perspective, remembering that life is a balance of holding on and letting go. Finding meaning. There is a sacredness in tears. They are not the mark of weakness, but of power. They are messengers of overwhelming grief and unspeakable love. I think we need to hold on to that in some way in order to keep our balance and our resilience. And remember that helping reconcile the pain and the possibilities, those two aspects that people bring in their bereavement, particularly when it's traumatic, is the route to resilience. And I like this image of the rainbow because it's when the sunshine shines in a particular way through the falling rain that we have that new creation of a rainbow. And I see that rainbow as a symbol of resilience. So I come to the end, and there is a link if anyone wants to make contact with me through my email or through the website we have, or my book Working with Loss and Grief, published by Sage, which describes a lot of the things I've talked about this afternoon in a lot more detail, is something that people might be interested in looking at. So thank you, and if there's any more questions, I'm aware we've run a little over time already, but if there's any more questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Linda. That was really, really interesting to hear, and we've already had loads of feedback coming in saying that people found that really helpful and they've taken a lot from it. So thank you very much for your time this afternoon. It's been great to hear from you.
Good.
And we've had a couple of questions come through, if you'd be happy to answer one or two.
So, yes, I'm happy to answer, yes.
There's a question that's come in saying that someone works in a time-limited counselling service, which they sometimes feel is not fully addressing the client's needs. And they ask, what are your thoughts on time-limited counselling? They ask, is 6 sessions always better than nothing, or are we potentially leaving clients more vulnerable?
Well, I mean, hopefully, depending on what happens in those 6 sessions, we wouldn't be leaving them more vulnerable. But I am very aware that the constraints of finance and commissioners who are paying for services and do it on the basis of very small, a small number of interventions does restrict what might be necessary for a lot of people. And this is where I think using something like the AAG scale actually gives us evidence of where people may need ongoing help after the 6 sessions. If your service can't do that, I think it's something to discuss with your managers, with your supervisors, and maybe then to look at what are the things you put in place for the next steps for those clients who still may not quite be at the point that we would like them to be at or they would like to be at. So I do think it's an organisational, it's a professional issue that perhaps has to be addressed. On the other hand, I think in the past there was a lot of very open-ended support given to people that was also unhelpful because it failed to recognise the points at which they were resilient and could move forward without the help of professional input.
Thanks very much for that answer, Linda. And I've just had another question that's come in, and that's saying, could the adult attitude to grief scale be adapted to be applied to child bereavement?
Yeah, we have got a number of versions of the scale, and there certainly is one for young people, one for children, one for pre-bereavement for patients who are ill and for their carers. The thing about the scale that I've described this afternoon, the main one used in bereavement, is that all of that has been totally validated, and although the notions from that are transferred into other versions, they still need some statistical validation. But again, part of the validation comes from practitioners using it and finding that it actually works. And if there are ways in which it doesn't work, then I'm interested to have feedback in order to look at are the ways that we can do further adjustments to it.
Well, thanks very much, Linda, and I think that's the end to all the questions that we've had in. So thank you very much again for your time this afternoon. It's been brilliant hearing from you. And
well, thank you. Thank you very much, and thanks to the listeners and the questions.
Well, people certainly seem to have found it useful, so thank you very much. And I've just had one more question in.
Right.
If you're happy to answer it.
Yeah.
It's someone asking who says they're a funeral director and they like to know how to bereave someone who's so bereaved that they feel that they're even unable to order a coffin. And they say this is the first time, even in their years of supporting bereaved people, that they've had this sort of experience.
I mean, I guess it goes back to having the opportunity, and I don't know whether this person can do it themselves, but just to be able to listen and absorb some of that excessive, I don't mean excessive in that it's inappropriate, but that huge distress, so that it can be absorbed and people can then find mind space in order to consider a practical thing like choosing a coffin. I guess the other thing is that it may happen that people are literally on their own, but presumably there may be other family members who, while you wouldn't want them to take over from the main mourner in making those choices, they may be in a position to give them some support and guidance in reaching a point where that's helpful.
Well, thank you very much for your answer, Linda, and yeah, that's it for the questions now. I don't think we've got any more coming.
That's great. That's great. Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk to people, and as I say, very happy to have other feedback directly, either through you or through my contacts.
That's fantastic, and we'll be in touch later with the feedback forms if you'd be interested in that to see what.
I would indeed. I would indeed.
Okay, that's great. I'll send those through to you in a bit. Right, fantastic. I'm going to shut down the webinar now.
That's great.
So I think both of us are going to disappear, but thanks very much again for your time.
No problem.
I'm going to close it down now then. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.